Okay, welcome to the August series of our initiative 2020, a year without public space under the COVID-19 pandemic. After 1 week break that we had just in the last week, we start into a new month with a full program of 4 new sessions. It seems like that break was maybe also quite good because for this particular session, we have 236 registration. So it seems like many people were excited to hear about the topic of today. For those that are new to our series, my name is Hendrik Tieben from Chinese University of Hong Kong, and with Luisa Bravo, we set up this session. And you can get in touch with us during the session with the Q&A function. And my colleague Ying and Chen, Stephanie Cheung, they will then select some questions for the roundtable discussion at the end. You can also send us emails anytime and say if you want to become a panelist. Actually, many people have done so, and we have got to know very exciting people and projects through this. Or you can even also propose a session. If you are interested to see more, you can also find our 12 earlier webinars on video on our YouTube channel. So let me now pass the word to Luisa Bravo, who will explain the details for today's sessions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hendrik, and welcome to our speakers and to all our attendees. As Hendrik mentioned, this is our fourth series. We already had 12 webinars in the past 3 months, and we are now counting participation and engagement of our previous sessions, and I can say that we had more than 1,500 registered participants in our previous webinars. And August is supposed to be a very exciting series since we are receiving a lot of very positive feedbacks, and we are already arranging webinars for this series, and since we are receiving so much interest, we are now starting to plan, which was not planned before, our fifth series in September. And so I would like to thank all those who are still with us following our series. I'm Luisa Bravo, and I'm the founder and editor-in-chief of the Journal of Public Space. Thank you very much for following. Today we have a co-host, Maurice Harteveld from Delft University of Technology from the Netherlands, who will be also the moderator of the roundtable discussion that we will run after all presentations from different speakers. We have speakers from the Netherlands, from Greece, from France, and from the United States. Thank you to all the speakers for joining this session. Now I give the floor to Maurice, who will be moderating presentations and discussions of today's webinar.
Thank you, Luisa. Let me first share the screen. Yes. I'm very happy that I could contribute to this seminar, and I would like to introduce the theme of the impact of the pandemic to street life and urban culture and beyond by the case of the Netherlands, my own country. We have seen a growing number of people hospitalized per day, particularly in March and April of this year. Percentage-wise, we could say that this is compared to other countries in Europe, yet it's more than in Korea or China, and much less than certain states in the US and, for example, Brazil. let me see, now it should move. Yes, quite some people unfortunately passed away, and it follows roughly the same curve. The particular moment in time, which was the most challenging one, was the end of March. Then the capacity of the hospitals was stressed, but foremost, the uncertainty among the population grew. What has started in, say, a southeastern part of the Netherlands, dotted in a circle, started to grow and spread all over the country. Here you see the stress. It was spread all over the country, and then particularly, perhaps now we have some experience, it spread it in the urban cores of the country. So what we here then saw is that there had to come a response from public government. There came first a call for public responsibility. People were asked to work at home, stay at a distance of 1.5 meters, say 2 arm lengths, and crowding was advised not to happen. So less than 3 people outside or inside was not advised, of course. We have seen it in other countries too. It was a call. There was no formal lockdown, unlike other countries in Europe. Yet what was happening is that public amenities and facilities were closed. So the closure of theaters, cinemas, sport facilities, restaurants and cafes, it all closed. And again, this is roughly seen elsewhere. Now, for the sake of this intro, within the Netherlands, I zoom into the city of Rotterdam as an example of the impact of the pandemic to street life and urban culture and beyond. So again, we didn't have a formal lockdown, unlike many countries in Europe. You have to understand this from ancient values in our society. We share with the globe the moral ethics and values of health. So health comes first. Whenever someone is in need, there is the ethical response to help them. This is nicely put forward by Erasmus from Rotterdam just before the Netherlands established, so already 500 years ago. It's an important humanist thinker, and it still is present in our society. So whenever our Prime Minister, shown in the upper right corner, called the population to stay at home, the ethical response was there and they stayed home. And whenever the mayor next to it repeated the message in the own sphere, we saw another effect of this. But that we didn't have a formal lockdown was, you could understand this from our social ethics and value of the freedom of will. Being free without too strong top-down power. This is particularly in the Netherlands an important way of thinking. Of course, this not always goes well. So the moral ethics and the social values conflict. So I want to introduce a kind of disclaimer that in the Netherlands it didn't go always as desired. Crowding and resistance is seen from time to time. In the early days we've seen it, parks were overcrowded, parties were organized, and modestly some resistance is taking place. And then the health sector introduces a public announcement really to stay at home. That's the labels put in screen. Particularly today, we see a kind of reluctance towards all the calls and the the desire to stay at home or keep a distance. It seems like people care less. Back to the early period of the pandemic, late March. The immediate response was indeed stay home. There was a great level of uncertainty, so people started to collect goods and hoard them inside their house. Outside in the city, although we were allowed to go outside as an individual or a family, it was extremely abandoned. Here you see some of the larger urban arteries in the city of Rotterdam. This is the image we have seen in Rotterdam, but also in other cities. And as you have seen in previous webinars, this is the image also in other cities around the globe. We can support this by Google Analytics. Travel reduced, people didn't go to workplaces, they didn't go that much to pharmacies or groceries. Retail, recreation and park, those areas were abandoned. People stay indeed at home. From home or from the neighborhood, population sent support to medical aid by signage on the streets, like this nice quote, "Together we are strong," or flaggings like "We're there for you." And in the center, the local government introduced measurements for urban hygiene. So sanitation was introduced all over the inner city of Rotterdam and major public anchor points. It also added to the creation of awareness. Everywhere in the city, particularly in Rotterdam and other bigger cities, we see signs and symbols reminding people to stay on distance. This is the immediate response, a strong focus on social distance. But graphs showed introduced a reduction of mobility. It's still there, but people started to travel, started particularly to go to parks. And again, today, I just got a pop-up news message that the beaches are crowded again. People, the freedom of will brings people back to their old patterns. They want to go to parks, they want to go to beaches, etc. So today the city of Rotterdam introduced new measurements for the inner city. You have to wear a face mask to, not so much for healthy reasons, more for changing the social behavior amongst the people to stay indeed on distance. This is not only in the inner city, but also in major cores, other cores of Rotterdam. People became used to the situation and seek their way out. They might be bored from staying at home, or they search for a kind of summer break. So again, crowding takes place in the city. But the outcome at the moment, after just say a week of this newborn crowding, is that the numbers of diagnosed people in Rotterdam is increasing, but mostly these are young people with a huge social network, and then the hospitalization is less. So what we see in the Netherlands is that public spaces are, especially in the urban cores, are populated again. So can we look beyond this? Can we look beyond the pandemics? That is, in this discussion, I think, one of the interesting questions we ask ourselves. Do we see already impacts on street life and urban culture which could bring us towards a time after pandemics, whenever that may be? Well, obviously, the question is this like what you see on the screen? Is this like the future? Shall we find ourselves in public spaces in our own bubble? I like this example in Rotterdam. Shall we introduce a furniture which keeps us on distance? Signs, symbols again. That's questionable. What will be the effect on public space on the long term? The effect of street life, which we have seen in the Netherlands during the high days of the pandemics, is that crowding is avoided and roads are blocked. But above all, space for people by foot increased. We have seen examples in New York pushed forward by Thessaly in one of the previous seminars. This is like an embryonic sign which may take longer, is present beyond pandemics. We also see the effect of urban culture. Streets are revitalizing already now. Terraces are extended, parks are discovered too as an alternative for the major city parks. This might be a way towards the future. In the city of Rotterdam, it catalyzed large-scale planned pedestrianization and greening of the city. Large arteries were already on the list of becoming largely pedestrianized. So this is the next level beyond, say, old school examples of Copenhagen. Large arteries are greened, cross points all over the city. And all those plans are now started. But this is embedded in a situation where the economic downfall has started. So also in the Netherlands, we have seen that the vacancy rates of retail and offices increase and people modestly lose their jobs. It's their first signs. So what will this be? A green inner city without old school shops and office buildings? Well, I presume that this is part of an ongoing socio-economic restructuring or maybe destructuring following trends which are already present in our cities for a decade. People, proactive citizens, appropriate streets. People more and more work at the home office, and whenever we can, we shop online. It already is part of our city, and this all together may support an expected increase of domestic and local life in public space, which means that we appropriate the spaces near our houses because we work at house. We work at the home office, we shop online, it's all already in our direct proximity, and we also seek perhaps local leisure. We don't travel that much, planes are on the airfields. And if you add to this the expected unemployment, people have less means, economic crisis which occurs, keep people limited in the possibilities they might seek their future nearby. So what are the design challenges we have? And this is the last slide. In the times to come? Well, perhaps generic infrastructure, which is dominated by a kind of global city image, lacks of local public spaces. So people living there may need spaces which they could be called theirs, community spaces. High-rise, which is omnipresent in Rotterdam, without a kind of sufficient public space on the street level and in the interior, may be challenged because people don't have this local public space and they might seek for it. Particularly also in dense urban environments, dense neighborhoods with small dwellings and perhaps narrow view or little public spaces, people with a low income, which we have seen examples all over the globe. It's not yet slumming, but it's like seeking for urban spaces close by to engage community life. That's a challenge we have. And then lastly, particularly in large cities on our planet, we have the newcomers. People flock from city to city. They go from the hinterland to the city. Newcomers always are present. Are they part of these local public spaces and what is theirs? Or people which are more reactive and less proactive? Do they also take part of this local public space, or do they need another kind of public space? These, I think, are all questions which we could ask ourselves in this seminar, and particularly in the roundtable debate. We will see. I think particularly these questions, like other cases, are challenging our desire to create public spaces for domestic and local life and bring health and free will together. So thank you. Now I stop sharing, and I would like to pass the word to Angeliki.
Hello everyone, I'm Angeliki, and as Luisa said, I'm an architect and urban designer coming from Greece and living the last 4 years in the Netherlands. But before I start my presentation, I would like to thank you for the honor to present my observations about public space in Greece during the outbreak of coronavirus. But what can be said about COVID-19 that hasn't been said already? Rather than simply presenting and talking about numbers, about cases and deaths, I would like to share my life experience in my hometown. And probably you don't know it because it's a medium-sized city on the northern part of Greece. It is called Alexandroupolis, and it is an important waterfront port city with around 60,000 people. It has not an official public space, central square, as many cities have, but it provides people with some open public spaces, with the most important to be along the recently redeveloped waterfront, a big city park in the west of the city, and many streets with cafes and taverns, mainly in the city center and along the waterfront. But coming to the subject of COVID-19, on the 17th of March, BBC News announced the outbreak of coronavirus has led to the emptying of public spaces around the world. All media presented an image of cities to which weren't used: abandoned streets, mass transportation without masses, closed stores, people at home, silence, the so-called ghost cities. We were bombarded with images of metropolitan areas, big famous cities, popular touristic destinations. But what about a medium-sized city in Greece? Returning from the Netherlands to Greece a few days before the big lockdown, I confronted a new Greek reality. The Greek government took strict measures quite fast, and the movement of people was permitted for a prescribed set of essential reasons. Citizens leaving their homes were required to have with them their ID or passport. They had also to send a message or carry a signed attestation in which personal information and the purpose of going out were stated. As the reasons for going out were limited, it was observed a tendency towards the sixth reason: sport, exercise, walking the dog. It is not so common for Greek people to be so physically active, so many images and videos were created during that time, making fun of the sudden turn of Greeks towards sports and their need for a pet. Here, for example, you can see a Greek people during before the coronavirus and during the coronavirus. However, this sudden turn towards working out appeared also in the form of walk and stroll, transforming the whole city in a lively walking route. Every area of the city was full of people, mainly walking, studying, or resting on a bench. Even in not well-known, undefined, or unused places, the presence of people started to be noticeable, with a preference towards local places, and the recently redeveloped waterfront didn't lose its popularity. This period, it was also impossible to find an empty bench. Apart from benches, every element which can be used as a sitting place was also utilized. Pedestrians and cyclists were more much for the cars. In the absence of cars, made people to use also the streets in order to walk and to keep the appropriate distances from each other. Cafes, bars and taverns were closed, so the sidewalks were free for walk without the coffee tables, umbrellas and other elements blocking the accessibility and walkability of specific places. The Greek coffee drinking culture was not disappeared though. Many small cafes offered the option of takeaway, and Greek people enjoyed their coffee in public space, socializing with others but always from distance. Despite the readjustment on the proxemics, it seems that COVID-19 made people more social in public space. They stopped more often to greet each other and discuss from distance. They weren't in a rush, so they did it for longer. Socializing with unknown persons changed as well. Unknown people smiled to each other and exchanged glances of sympathy. However, the changes in street life weren't the same during the whole period. The different kind of measures and the steps towards the normalcy appeared in different times, influencing so the behavior of Greeks in public space and the city life. According to me, 3 are the important starting dates in which I observed differences in the public city life. The first is the general lockdown and the strict restrictions on all the non-essential movements. During that period, a lot of people were walking in the city alone or in pairs. The weather conditions played an important role on the decision of people to go out or not. Benches were used mainly by old people who sat alone or young people who gathered in groups. The second day is the 4th of May, with a slackening of the rules about going out of home for a reason. That period, more people were in the streets than before. Cyclists made also their appearance. Benches and all the possible sitting places were full of people from different ages. Children started to play again in the playgrounds. The majority of people were in groups of 3 to 5 people. In the end, the last day begins with the gradual reopening of the cultural and recreational amenities. In the beginning, only a few people were in the cafes and taverns. Most of them preferred walking and doing other activities in the city. Gradually, there was a mix of activities with a great preference towards the beaches for swimming. Coming to an end, we all know that for years much of Europe has looked down on Greece as an insolvable problem, and probably still does. The economic depression that Greece has experienced for more than 10 years and the measures which were implemented since 2008 had many consequences for the country and the citizens. And one of those was, of course, on the health system. But probably the economic crisis made Greece to build community resilience in unexpected and difficult circumstances, like the outbreak of coronavirus. As George Pavlatos, a political economist, said, Greeks reacted to the lockdown with surprise compliance, a legacy of the economic crisis. Greece has been in almost non-stop crisis mode, so society was better prepared to enter a state of alert. Although the situation in Greece now it is more crucial than before due to the arrival of many tourists, for all its inherent frailties in this pandemic, Greece these times can walk with its head held high and constitute a showcase of community resilience. Thank you.
Thank you, Angeliki. Shall we now go to Fabiano?
Maybe you can make your presentation again on full scale.
Yeah.
Thank you. It was already.
I was just looking for how to unmute the microphone.
No problem.
Okay. Okay. Good afternoon to everyone. I just would like to say something about a prayer for what happened to Beirut, because it's a tragedy that happens so unexpected and also expected, and affect the city, the people there, and the public space, and all the citizens and us as people all around the world. And because I have many people there, this day I was a little bit touched and in strictly contact with people living there and facing this trauma. Now I go fast to my presentation. It's my first thought that I was thinking also, since I was looking at these images that were the first images of the lockdown, that it was also related us with the public space, mostly through the TV or to the screen, are these very famous, many famous around the world, squares completely empty. There were a lot of debate about these images. There were many praise about the beauty of architecture that finally is revealed. But at the other side, there were also many complaints about the end of the public space as a space for sociality. Most probably, both comments were a little bit unbalanced in consideration of the temporary nature of the lockdown, and also in relation to that we don't know exactly what is going to happen tomorrow. And what is very important in these images is not their actual status of emptiness, is that their truly nature as public space is the ability and the possibility for a public space of being something else. That means the potentiality that every public space should have embedded into its space, into these famous squares, but all the public space that we consider all around the world. A public space is a space that can take different configuration, can be used every time in a different ways, and can be appropriated, but it also can be a space of conflict or of democratic participation. I think one of the main effect of the pandemics, not during the lockdown, but as a consequence, as a permanent consequence, is the diffusion of mass surveillance on public spaces. This happened into using different means, like the mobile tracking for checking movement of people, but also the presence of camera inside the urban landscape. Of course, this is nothing that is new. These measures have been implemented since before. And the case of China is quite interesting because it's been reported that, for example, during major events like the 2008 Olympic Games and the 2010 Shanghai Expo, mass surveillance increased a lot. And also during the pandemic is another case that a state of emergency allow very restrictive measurement. We should also remember that international human rights say that measures should be taken properly accordingly to the lawful, necessary, and proportionate to the condition of humans and of people living there. I was really, except of course about, we have many cases mostly about related to tactical urbanism, social distancing that's being implemented. I was struck about some gatherings that happened. One is the first in Berlin on Saturday, the previous Saturday, and the one is in various places in Italy, I think a couple of weeks ago, that gathering of people to protest against government, gather to protest against temporary measurement, so measurement that we don't know how they will last, maybe not a lot, not so much, or maybe a lot, we don't know this, but also gathering without taking care of measures like social distancing or the wearing of the mask became an act of contestation. It's also interesting that during the last month mostly, accordingly to the media freedom violation, and there is the list of the media freedom violation, there are many cases of journalists that has been attacked in public spaces, both by the police or by the demonstration. This creates a kind of, I think, a big problem about public space became, or still considered, places for a democratic participation, and on the other side, they are becoming a very space of conflict that they are not really raising a lot of alarm from a point of view on mainstream newspaper, or also in us, that we, in a way, we are living most of the time in a confinement at home. Two cases in Greece are quite was quite interesting because they happen in a distance of a few days. This is a gathering of youngers in a square in a neighborhood, mostly a residential neighborhood, that gathered together during the night around 2. There were, according to the sources, between 200 and 300 people. They gather illegally without social distancing, without mask, and the police intervene to dismantle this gathering, and this happened quite quickly in a couple of hours. 1 week ago, 1 week after this event, there was the opening of the renovation of one of the major squares in Athens, and people gathered together with this kind of official happening, together with the mayor and the official from the mayor, and nothing happened except that the day after the mayor intervened on the social media saying the excuse. This kind of disparity of treatments, I think, is a kind of point of how public space are used and how public space are used by whom. Another aspect that happened during, I think, the previous week, is that the Greek government passed a law with that is a kind of restriction for a public demonstration. This case, in a way, it's a kind of limitation of the democratic participation in the square, but mostly is a limitation of how public space can be truly used accordingly to the different needs of different parts and yes, parts of the society. Another aspect in this kind of schizophrenic management of the post-lockdown in Greece is also that has been reported many interventions by the police to against people on the street, or they're just drinking on the street, or they're using public space for small gathering. Has been reported that many of these interventions by the police were implemented with violence, and not only with just giving some advice. A final aspect that I would like to pinpoint here is how the impact of refugees in the context of the post-lockdown. And here we can find another kind of schizophrenic policy. When there were lockdown release, the lockdowns continue to go on in refugees camp for 2 or 3 weeks. So policies by the government were different between refugees camp and cities and public spaces. Notwithstanding, after that, the government released 11,000 refugees, beneficiaries of international protection. It means that to this beneficiary has not been had been evicted by their house, have been released to the street. During this post-lockdown, there are parts of Athens that have been inhabited literally by refugees without any kind of protection. And we should also remember, as we know and we read many times, how the pandemic is not really democratic because it's affecting mostly the poorest strata of the society. And indeed, many of these refugees that are now inhabiting and using the public space as a primary need of living in the city have been contracted the COVID-19. This should be also thought in comparison with the major urban renovation that are implemented in the city center of Athens. I'm not going inside any kind of comments about the design and the urban impact of the design, but just to notice how official intervention in the city most of the time are unrelated to what is happening into the smallest street and into the daily life, daily life of people and different classes. Just to conclude here, the question that I would like to raise with this small presentation is to raise a question about for whom are the public space and what are the kind of policies that should be implemented in a way that all the classes and all the people can be tackled to protect in a way from the still going on effects of the pandemic or this kind of the new normal that we still discussing and we are probably, I don't know if we will find in few months. Thank you.
Thank you, Fabiano. So, Vaso, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you for the invitation. It seems that today's session is mostly devoted to the Greek case studies, and I'm really happy about this. I'll start with just a bit of data that you might already know. Greek cities are densely built. You see an image of Athens in your screen. And the structure is based on a dense combination of urban blocks and streets. There are very few cases of modern movement planning in Greek cities. And this means that Greek cities lack the open green spaces that this model of planning had introduced in European planning tradition. And as you might know, Greek cities have the lowest ratio among European cities as far as the green spaces and parks are concerned. And this is why I'm telling this, because this means that the main public space in Greek cities are the streets and the public squares. This is the locus of the urban life here. And this urban life is a typical urban life of the Mediterranean cities, which means co-presence, people strolling around, using coffee shops as areas of meeting friends, family, or even conducting informal working sessions. Greek cities are also cities where mobility is heavily based on private cars. Public transport is not adequate, and this has created a dependence, both practical and cultural, on private transport. In densely built areas, such as the city centers, there are not enough parking space. And at the same time, pavements for pedestrian movement in general, are limited. So you have a kind of basic idea of, let's say, the features of public space in a typical Greek city. I would like to focus now today on an aspect of the COVID effect on street life. And this aspect is related to metrics and the ways that metrics can either transform our cultural patterns, which is, let's say, the bad scenario, or they may transform the city, which is, let's say, again, in inverted commas, the good scenario. Now, as in most European cities, in Greece also have been introduced measures, metrics to public coexistence and co-presence, and these are these kind of typical 1.5 meter for sitting and moving people. Or another typical measure, which is the 15 square meters per customer when somebody wants to go inside the shop. I'm very, very grateful to Angeliki, because in her presentation, she introduced the metrics of proximity, and she integrated these metrics of proximity into a specific culture, which is the Greek culture. And this kind of proximity in general is I think it's a major issue in public life, at least in the Mediterranean area. With high number of people walking, being in the streets, and making streets safe and friendly. And in this respect, it's a kind of, let's us remember Jane Jacobs, old ideas about the presence in the city, the pedestrian presence in the city, and the safe city issues in the 60s. So, COVID restrictions have been introduced within this specific cultural context which values and favors proximity. And imposing the metrics could really create two different directions. One is the direction of, let's say, agoraphobia. Less people want to go in the streets, less people are in the streets, especially if we consider that fines have been introduced in terms of this kind of proximity. So this is one way, less people in the public space, and there is the other way, how we can enlarge, let's say, enlarge enlarge public space in inverted commas, or maybe not in inverted commas, so that we can accommodate more people. And we had, these last months, we had a number of issues. One of these is the project that Fabiano also presented 5 minutes ago, which is the Great Walk of Athens. It's a typical project of tactical urbanism. The municipality of Athens actually implemented this project, transforming some traffic lanes into pedestrian and bicycle routes by very basic means. And of course, the implementation area is limited in the center of the cities, and that was a point of very strong critique, as Fabiano said before. But at the same time, it provided a valid example of low-cost pedestrian-friendly intervention. So, and although, of course, tactics like this are well known in other European cities, we have to remember that Paris Place, for example, initiated in 2002. That was the first project of this scale in the Greek cities. So that was a paradigm where the public space for pedestrians was enlarged and incorporated space which up to then was for traffic. Parallel to that, and I'm sorry for the photographs, I have borrowed them from the web. It's in LA, not in Greece, but similar things are happening in Greece. Parallel to that, there is a new framework, let's say, that allows shops, coffee shops or restaurants to expand their tables into the parking lane or the parking space which is in front of the shop. Thus again, expanding the space into areas which up to that were meant for traffic. So we have these, we've got this kind of, let's say, tendencies. On the one hand, we have the restrictions of being in public space. On the other hand, we have this tendency of expanding areas meant for pedestrians and cyclists into the areas which were traditionally occupied and performed for traffic, for private cars. Of course, nothing is as simple, and it's not a matter of deciding what is the good or what is the bad, because we've got conflicts in all this story, and these conflicts we have to handle, we have to consider and handle. Dependency on private transportation creates conflicts because the implementation of projects in favor of pedestrians diminishes the traffic and parking spaces. So there are consequences, there are traffic jams, for example. So there is this kind of conflict which is always present in planning projects in the Greek cities. The other threat, let's say, it's not a conflict, but it is a threat, is that the temporary expansion of coffee shops on pedestrian areas, and not only on parking spaces, but also on pedestrian areas, are feared that it may create permanent situations, as was also described by previous speakers. So this, let's say, temporary solution will eliminate eventually the space available to pedestrians. So there are these kind of always issues and questions, and we have to try to, not to find a solution, but we have to try to persuade, and by this I will conclude, we have to persuade or to shape the decision-making bodies towards practices that support all kinds of people, all groups of people, to have access to streets and squares. We have to try to shape the decision-making bodies towards an environmental friendly model of urban life, and we have to do this because streets and public squares are these spaces are the cornerstones of democracy. It's the areas where everybody can exist, everybody can be together with some other people, not necessarily the area of community, but the area, let's say, of virtual community, of the community to be. Well, thank you.
Thank you for your observation, sharing of it. Now the next presenter is Edna. In the mean, if anyone in the audience has questions for the session after the presentation, please do it in the Q&A bar.
Okay, now I think everyone can hear me, right?
Yes.
Well, thanks to start off. Thank you for the invitation. So to prepare this presentation, I started with the most basic of things, a Google search. So this is it, post-COVID public space. And the results, well, as you can see, they are varied. They talk about adapting to the world to the new normal. And to summarize, we're talking about resilience, about the new normal, smart cities, technology, sustainability, masks, restaurants, bikes, tape. So there's a lot to be said about how we are now realizing how vital public spaces are, how necessary it adapt our lives to this new normal, and how our lives have changed. What lives are we talking about? The dominant discourse of COVID in cities is built around a single narrative, assuming the crisis has been more or less the same. It establishes an ongoing story in 3 acts: business as usual, disrupted by the lockdown, empty streets and transformed routines, and a gradual return where we are revalorizing and rethinking the role of public space. And I use this image of l'Arc de Triomphe in Paris because first, it's very easy to find the before and after pictures of this emblematic place. And second, because as any French colleague will say, it's not every street in France, and it's not even any street in Paris. And Paris is not France. And this 3-act narrative is not the global narrative of urban life in a health crisis. This discourse fails to take into account other street lives and urban cultures that exist for a large part of the world, and the most vulnerable populations, who are dealing with the hardest aspects of the pandemic. Due to economic and social inequalities, other ways of organization of everyday life in public space already took place way before the pandemic happened. So for these sectors, this 3-act structure didn't happen, or didn't happen as neatly, if it did. For some populations, COVID-19 measures didn't imply a change, really, but only another constraint to deal with, along with the pre-existing complications of everyday street life. Sorry, for some, public space was never accessible to begin with. It was never accessible, nor inclusive, nor safe. Others already used public space for more than leisure or out of pre-existing needs. The pandemic, along with lockdown measures, exacerbate ongoing structural inequalities based on class, on race, income, or gender. And we can observe this at a micro level, meaning individuals that coexist in any given city, such as women, informal workers, racialized individuals, the elderly, essential workers, and homeless individuals. And also at a macro level, when we look at the countries of the Global South. Now, just to pick up an example. Women have a very poor perception of security in public space, even in normal times, due to sexual remarks, touching, rape, gender-related killings, etc. Conditions of everyday life in public space, such as poor lighting, low pedestrian traffic, and walking alone, present greater risk for females. So, where in places where lockdowns were enforced, activity in streets dropped drastically during the day, and streets were desolate at night, except for informal workers in most cases. Some streets turn off. Since there's so this connectivity public transit networks was reduced, which represented longer distance of walking on empty streets. Moreover, new empty spaces blossomed due to businesses closing during and after lockdowns. And so sexual violence in public spaces didn't stop for women during this crisis. Cases in Chile, in the UK, Canada, Nigeria, Kenya, the Philippines, India, the US, Mexico, they all have registered cases of sexual violence against women while they were exercising outdoors, while they were working in public work settings, traveling to and from work. For example, in Mexico, essential workers such as female doctors and nurses were attacked and denied access to public transportation, and informal workers who couldn't afford to stop working. And this is particularly striking when we consider that, for example, the sector of informal workers in South Asia represents a 95% and 89% female informal workers, 89% in Sub-Saharan Africa, and 59% in the Latin Americas and the Caribbean. So this takes us to the other level I was talking about, the macro level, regarding the Global South. So when we talk about the pandemic, lockdown and social distancing have proved to work in diverse contexts. Certain conditions facilitate these protocols. The such as housing, mostly formal, clear distinction between the private and the public, between home and work, access to digital tools, access to water to wash hands easily and frequently, and formal employment. Now, these conditions are fairly common in the Global North, and in the Global South, they are fairly common only in elite neighborhoods. However, the conditions of urban life in the global south can be quite different when we consider that there exists reduced, shared, and unaffordable housing, informal and or auto-construct. Basic infrastructure is shared, such as toilets, kitchens, and water taps. There are high rates of unemployment. So as reference, informal workers in France represent 10% of total employment in France. And in Mexico, they represent 53%. So it's 53% of people who work on public space or that the livelihoods depend on mobility and contact with others. So in these conditions, lockdown and social distancing cannot be enforced, or at most only in the neighborhoods with higher resources. Technology that has been hailed as a way to keep going forward with, while on lockdown is still a luxury for many people. Again, referring to the case of Mexico, the Mexican government announced that, classes would continue by TV, not virtually, because people do not have children and do not have access to internet or a tablet or a computer. Home office also is not possible for many. So people still have to go to work, even if they are not essential workers. And many others have lost their jobs. For them during this crisis to informal employment, meaning contact with people in the public space. So it's sort of a cycle we're seeing here. So life in public space didn't stop. It continued with masks and with gloves, but it kept going on. And amidst violence from common and organized crime, and now from law enforcement trying to keep things under control in the midst of the pandemic. So for these populations that don't exactly fit the three-act structure that we saw previously, COVID didn't reveal new vulnerabilities. The urban majority has always been vulnerable. The crisis only intensified the vulnerabilities that were already there. So I believe it's our responsibility to take into account these other narratives, these other urban lives, so that we as experts can give a voice to these vulnerable communities, and we can take them into consideration in the present and the future of the pandemic. Feel free to add me on any of my socials, and I will post this presentation and the transcript on the webpage on the bottom. Thank you very much.
Thank you too, Edna. Vikas, you're the last presenter.
Yes, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. I'll just share my screen now. Again, thank you for hosting this. And we know that the title of the series is called 2020, A Year Without Public Space Under the COVID-19 Pandemic. So we saw these images that were also shown here in terms of how we suddenly had a loss of public space in terms of occupancy around the world. But I think as things unfold, we started to see that this contraction of public space, or this sort of emptying of public space, was only one narrative. And in many cases, there was a different kind of adjustment or adaptation, and in cases, an expansion. So this little presentation here is going to be more about a positive on the street life and the impact of the pandemic in a more optimistic way in going forward. So here are some images from a city called Cincinnati, Ohio.
Sorry, Vikas. Yeah, we do not see your presentation. Can you try again to share the screen, please?
Sure, I'll try again.
It was visible before, but it disappeared.
Yes. Yeah, and when you put it in full screen mode, it disappeared.
Do you see it now or you don't?
Yes, yes, we can see now. Thanks.
Okay, so yeah, so that's the first slide in any case. Yes, so we've seen this contraction, and we saw many of these images. These are just some images from Cincinnati in Ohio in the US, sort of mid-sized city in the Midwest. And as we know, all of the formal public spaces are closed. There is barely anybody there. There is sort of emptying of these large celebrated public spaces of cities. Are sort of other public spaces as institutions, like the libraries, are closed. Even the ones that are open are deserted. And there is virtually sort of no street life in where we typically accept or expect street life. At the same time, there is an expansion on the way happening in sort of what is called by sociologists a parochial space. So in the neighborhoods, you see a sudden change in behavior in terms of people trying to occupy their own spaces outside, many of which are private or neighborhood spaces, which are public. And you see all kinds of behaviors of interaction because there is really not much of the larger public spaces that are open. This expansion is not only in neighborhoods that have, in this case, fair amount of space, green space, but also in the inner city where the streets are actively used for casual socializing, for play. And it's very interesting to watch the dramatic change in the same city for occupancy in terms of the public space. So this change or this expansion brings about a very different kind of phenomena, particularly in the context of US cities, that this adaptation also brings an expansion of agency. So a large amount of public spaces that I showed earlier are extremely programmed, are extremely sort of held up by institutional structures that are often sort of held up by other structures which are very neoliberal, the public-private partnerships and a lot of private money. But once we are shunning these hyper-designed, theme programmed sort of private or quasi-public spaces, like in this case, the malls, what is becoming clearer is how we are transforming spaces that are certainly managed, but they are not programmed in any way by a lot of the agencies. So what happens is the agency is getting transferred to the people in their ability to use, interpret, and sort of occupy these public spaces, which is a very interesting phenomena in the US because everything is sort of guided, but not particularly agency transferred to the common public. So the space has now been left in many ways raw and unembellished. And that is an opportunity for citizens to particularly try and do what they would like to do with public space. And again, these may not seem unusual sort of behaviors in most cities around the world, but in the US, these kinds of behaviors where you occupy the street and sort of take over is very, very interesting. And the use of streets by children is a great example of how this reinterpretation or adaptation of space is showing us our ability in terms of freedom, invention, and creative play, not only spatially, but also temporally, because now if children are occupying these spaces closer to home, they are able to do that for much longer time. And it's not only children, it's people, how they are occupying the streets, how they are interacting with each other, where they are interacting with each other is particularly interesting. So in other ways, if you want to see and think about this spatially, there is a typological switch from these spaces being vacated, but other spaces being occupied, which have always been there. So we see people running, jogging in the middle of the streets, people taking more to natural spaces for getting the exercises they need. If you look at the picture here, the benches stay unused, but people start to occupy space in a way where they are taking the agency. And the most interesting to me is this wall where people said, okay, if programmed sport is unavailable, we can actually start to interpret that. And this is all happening in one mid-sized city. So it's very interesting to see how other spaces that are available begin to get used. Finally, I think the case here is a modest case for thinking about the future, particularly in places, in cities in the US where public health is a huge concern, not only in terms of physical health, but perhaps more importantly in terms of psychological health, that we are a society that doesn't particularly interact the way that many other places in the world do. And we see more and more sort of rise in terms of just the emotional stress on people in their sort of lockdown conditions. And there is a hope that while this is not a time to romanticize the current situation, we want to go back to work and to learn and to socialize and go to our leisure spaces. There are lots of opportunities in terms of public spaces becoming a part for public health, but different kind of public spaces. Perhaps these are spaces that, like I said earlier, are parochial public spaces that are less programmed, that are less managed, that have the ability to provide the agency to the people themselves to then reinterpret public spaces. So the idea that this availability of space that is around us can be put to use for other sort of public interactions may be a sort of a future for cities like this. So there's the argument is that there is a vast amount of parochial space, which is public, in residential neighborhoods, whether they are parks, play areas, community gardens, and more importantly, residential streets. And we might not consider these to be the foremost for political action, but these are spaces that are, in fact, have the ability to create a social glue and to live healthier lives. And the hope is that this contraction, which is leading to an expansion in different place, can be adapted and it might generate an augmented public space. Thank you.
Thank you, Vikas. So we have a nice set, I think, very nicely aligned set of presentations in which, as Vikas put forward, we have the positive view on street life, the change in behavior as well as Angeliki has put forward, but also raising the question to what extent behavior really changes. And then we have the concerns in terms of other effects of the pandemic on the long term, as put forward by Fabiano, concerns in terms of the dominance of metrics in our urban field by Vaso. And we have the concerns of the vulnerable groups, as highlighted by Edna. Vikas, if I may start with you, I very much share the observation of and the hope you expressed. And your observations are based within the US setting. Yet if you take a step across the border and you would go along with Edna to Mexico City, do you think this hope could embed in that city?
So I don't know Mexico City very well, but I could easily imagine that this could be in India, in Delhi, where I grew up, where none of the things that I'm showing are a surprise. Life occurs in this way all the time, or even in Greek cities, as we might imagine, that the parochial spaces outside of homes are very much public, and they are sort of in ways extremely part of private public life. In Indian cities and Indian streets, for example, the biggest contrast is that a lot of private behavior occurs in public streets. And so that is not something new in sort of, I would imagine, even in Mexico City. But perhaps the question here is then the ability for us to recognize these parochial streets or parochial spaces as public spaces and provide the kind of infrastructural support and funding that we do to what we typically call sort of public space, the public space. In a case like this, I think the modest case I'm making is that we need to think about these near home public spaces or parochial spaces and really, really sort of provide the kind of infrastructural support they need.
Yes. Ying Feng, it might relate to one of the questions we got from the audience.
Yes. Yeah, I just figured out I muted myself and you probably couldn't hear me. And also, yeah, here is a question. I think today this audience is they all want to know more about the detailed design to specific space in the future after the COVID pandemic. And here's a question talking about what do you think that the space in our public mobility spaces, like a bus terminus station, can be changed? And I think this question is very interesting because as I know, in some cities, this kind of bus station, they will have a specific area and the camera will directly monitor that place. And the government will suggest like a woman or some vulnerable minorities group, they can stand there to wait for bus because that's kind of more safe. So I think this question maybe touch upon different speakers today and all your ideas about no matter which is a public space or how could this vulnerable group can survive still in the post-pandemic public space design and also this kind of a civilian situation. So maybe I'm wondering any of you could try to answer this question from your point of view.
Let's start with Vaso. It might touch upon your views.
I think it depends on how long this situation will continue to be that strict. Because if it continues, then we might see the change of typologies of public buildings, let's say, or this kind of waiting buildings, let's say, because this kind of bus station is a kind of waiting building. As in an airport, you have these huge areas of waiting areas. So if this situation goes on for some time, then we might see the reduction of these areas, the changing of typology, where we will have more bus lanes, more frequent transport so that people don't have to wait, and less waiting spaces inside the buildings. But it depends, it's really, you know, this idea of changing typology that might be interfered with what we are thinking about the future.
Yes, and Edna, could you add?
On the same question, right? Well, I agree with Vaso that in certain contexts we need to rethink about public spaces for public transportation. But and again, referring to the case study of Mexico, first I think we would have to think about what kind of public transportation already existed, or what kind of transportation already existed, because to rethink bus stations, for starters, we need to have bus stations, which is not necessarily the case in many countries of the global south. And well, as the same, Paris is not France, Mexico City is not Mexico. And in many cities of Mexico, people actually are using more their cars, because since public transportation was already deficient, it was already expensive, very, it didn't take you where you need to go. You had to take a lot of time to use it, and it was dangerous. People already aspire to use cars. And in a situation where you're going to be stuck like a sardine in a deficient bus, people are using even more the services such as taxi, Uber, private cars, to the point that they are giving mass, and you have to go to a parking lot and you have to honk to worship or and stuff like that. So I think that, well, in some contexts, we are moving forward to a more sustainable public transportation. In other contexts, due to this crisis, we're moving backwards. The few steps that we have already taken to improve in terms of sustainability and mobility are being eroded by these circumstances. So again, I think the contextualization and thinking about these other urban lives, it's very important. We cannot necessarily grab certain models and implement them verbatim in these other contexts.
Yes, thank you. Angeliki, you have put the emphasis on the behavioral change in mid-sized Greek city like Alexandropolis. The change has been there, but people returned also to their old habits. Have you also seen a return to the car use, which is so prominent in the Greek cities?
Yeah, of course it was again, and yeah, the presence of cars were there again. Yeah, and yeah, quite like in the past. So yeah, I don't know if they change their habits.
There's an interesting statistic that came out in the US, is that in late March and early April, bicycle sales really went crazy, and you couldn't find a bicycle, and you couldn't even get your bicycle repaired or serviced because everybody was backlogged. Well, in a month from then, late April, early May, or mid-May, reports came out that car sales had skyrocketed. So you see the behavior sort of, as Edna was mentioning, suddenly sort of changed back to these bubbles. For some, the bubbles were on bicycles, but for others, the bubbles were the typical bubbles that we think about, for cars.
If car use is increasing, it would conflict somehow, or at least challenge the creation of local public spaces or the search for new topology in the occupied areas of the urban spaces, right? Fabiano, could you reflect on the challenge of the conflict of the new technologies or old school technologies which have been present in our cities, and a kind of hope we share? Who's in charge? Oh, you're muted, by the way.
I always forget to turn on the microphone. At first, it should be noted that these technological changes are not related to the pandemic, as many of the problems that have emerged during the pandemic are problems the cities are afflicted of since many years. The pandemic, in a way, brought it to the ground many of the urban issues that we have already problems, and maybe we're not able, or we don't have the confidence or the power also to bring as a main theme of discussion. And but also the pandemic drove everything very fast because of its state of emergency. In the state of emergency, as we know, powers are stronger. differences are stronger. And of course, the use of technology, but as I was proposing in my presentation, it was not only related to technology, but it was about a system of controlling spaces. I think that what I wanted to present mostly in my presentation was basically what Vikas really clear pointed out with a phrase, stay away from over-design spaces. I think that this phrase is not only related to the matter of design, but it's a matter of using space. So if we think about, we have a clear example in city center design for tourism with the change of the inhabitants that are pushed away to leave space to Airbnb. These are kind of monofunctional space. In a way that enlarging the use of public space is about enlarging the design, enlarging the possibilities, enlarging the space physically, but also the way that different people can appropriate and can use it with more fantasy. No, there was this beautiful picture by Veda that in this park people were sitting informally. This is a way, let's say, that I think that is really the real characteristic of public space, the possibility of living in different way and the possibility of many people gathering together or being using at different time. Of course, highly controlled public space in a way cut off many of these uses. Not only because there is this way of surveillance, but there's also the kind of inhibition by the ones that are using it. No, of course, it's different doing something freely if you are in front of a camera and you see the camera or not. So it's not only a matter of control, it's also about a matter of urban landscapes and how urban landscapes are designed. So the highly presence of surveillance tools like cameras and so on, the knowledge of being tracked by through a phone is a kind of limitation on the potentialities of each of us. So I think this is the main characteristics of what we have to think about the future of public spaces. No? Enlarging not only physically, no, having more space, but also in their potentialities of being every time something else, but still maintaining its real essence of being the place of the really true meaning of public space, the space of democracy, the space of representation of the whole community, and above all, the place of inclusion. So I would like to answer to your question that technology is not only a controlling system, and is also an inhibiting system in how we can approach the living inside the city.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for this clarification. Now I would like to give back the word to Luisa to wrap up and give your view.
Thank you, Maurice, and thank you to all the speakers, and also to the attendees that I see are still following our discussion. And I'm happy that we had this conversation on street life, because actually I've been reading a lot of articles in the past months regarding street life. This is the main question: how street life will change for all of us in the way we will be living our cities, and we will be enjoying being in public space again after the pandemic. It's very difficult to say when this pandemic will end, because we are experiencing second wave in many different countries. In Italy, we are expecting a second wave in October. So restrictions are in place. Hendrik is in third wave, probably in Hong Kong. So restrictions are still in place, and so we will actually witness this behavioral adaptation of people living in cities, and I think we will be also surprised to see how people will become more resilient during this very long and very stressful pandemic period. Nobody knows when we will be safe again. People say, health experts in Italy say that probably this will be over by the end of 2021. So long time to experience the pandemic and to discuss more about how will we live together in public space after the pandemic. Thank you all for joining this session. I just want to make a small announcement regarding the next webinar that will take place next Thursday, August 13. We already have a number of speakers engaged from UK, Qatar, Malaysia, Brazil, and Poland on innovative approaches and creative practices in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. As you know, the second webinar of the month is dedicated to this particular topic, and we see that this series is really successful, and we are getting a lot of very interesting responses. So we will publish soon the agenda of this webinar, and of course you can follow the Journal of Public Space also on our social media, where we always announce the webinar. And if you are not subscribed to our mailing list, please do, because we send announcements and invitations to future webinars and future activities. Also, I remember you can apply to our call for speakers. You can find details on the website of the Journal of Public Space under COVID-19 initiative. So I give the floor to Hendrik if you want to say something to close this webinar.
Yeah, thank you very much also from my side to all the attendees today and our great panel. I thought it was very interesting. We had kind of so many contributions from Greece, which basically is, of course, in terms of the history of public space, a very essential contribution, we can say, but also to see what happens to public space today, right, in 2020. And also to have these perspectives from Mexico and United States. So we are still learning each time. So I'm very happy about this. I might add also that we are at the moment considering there are first plans to see how to wrap up maybe at the end of the year this whole series with a particular event. So we won't tell too much about this, but there will be something special, I think, coming later this year. So stay tuned. And we already also posted here the YouTube channel if anyone wants to see the earlier videos. So thank you very much, and tune in again for the next Thursday. Thanks very much.
Bye.
Bye bye everyone.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Bye.